November 7, 1944. Morville-les-Vic, France. 0530 hours. The pre-dawn air hung thick with diesel fumes and the metallic tang of rain-soaked steel. Frost clung to the hulls of 34 Sherman tanks idling in formation along a muddy access road that carved through the skeletal remains of what had once been French farmland. The engines rumbled like distant thunder, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the bones of every man standing in the half-light. Captain David Williams stood in the commander's hatch of his M4 Sherman, his breath visible in the November cold, watching the horizon where the German lines waited somewhere beyond the morning mist. His hands, dark against the worn leather of his gloves, gripped the edge of the turret. Behind him, 33 other tank commanders performed the same ritual, checking equipment, reciting silent prayers, preparing their minds for what the daylight would bring. They were the 761st Tank Battalion. They were black soldiers in an American army that had debated whether they should even be allowed to fight. And in exactly 23 minutes, they would roll into combat for the first time, beginning what would become one of the longest continuous combat deployments of any armored unit in the European theater. 183 days. No rotation. No rest. No relief. None of them could have known, standing there in that frozen French dawn, that they were about to shatter every assumption the U.S. Army had made about race and combat effectiveness. None of them could have predicted that their battalion would cut through German fortifications the Wehrmacht had spent months perfecting, or that their Sherman tanks would become symbols of something far more dangerous to fascism than mere firepower. They would become proof that the ideology of racial supremacy was a lie that could be destroyed with precision, courage, and relentless forward momentum. The American military of 1944 was an institution built on segregation. While the nation mobilized against Hitler's race-based tyranny abroad, it maintained its own system of racial hierarchy at home and within its armed forces. Black soldiers were relegated to service units, quartermaster companies, and labor battalions. The prevailing doctrine, endorsed by senior commanders and codified in War Department policy, held that black troops lacked the intelligence, discipline, and emotional stability required for combat roles. They could load supplies. They could drive trucks. They could build bridges and bury the dead. But to place them in tanks, to give them high-velocity cannons and the responsibility of armored warfare, that was considered a dangerous experiment, one that most of the military establishment believed would end in catastrophic failure. The 761st Tank Battalion was formed in March 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, an installation deep in the segregated South where the men training to become tankers faced hostility not just from the German enemy they would eventually fight, but from the very communities surrounding their base. They trained under white officers initially, men who often shared the racial prejudices of the era. But the battalion also attracted a different kind of leadership, officers who saw potential where the institution saw liability, who recognized that skill and courage had no color. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates became their commanding officer, a white West Point graduate who would prove to be one of the most crucial figures in their story. Bates believed in his men with a ferocity that bordered on defiance. He fought the Army bureaucracy to secure proper equipment, insisted on the same rigorous training standards applied to white armored units, and refused to tolerate discrimination within his command. Under his leadership, the 761st became proficient in tank gunnery, mechanized tactics, and combined arms operations. They became, by every measurable standard, combat ready. But readiness did not translate to deployment. For 2.5 years, the 761st remained in the United States. Training and retraining, watching white armored battalions ship overseas while they remained stateside. The message was clear: America did not trust them with the fight. The military hierarchy believed that placing black tankers in combat would undermine morale, that white soldiers would refuse to fight alongside them, that the entire experiment would collapse under the weight of racial tension. The 761st waited. They maintained their skills. They drilled in the Louisiana heat, running their tanks through obstacle courses, firing thousands of rounds at target ranges, perfecting the choreography of armored warfare. And they seethed with frustration, knowing they were being denied the opportunity to prove themselves not because they lacked capability, but because of the color of their skin. The breakthrough came in the summer of 1944, when the realities of the European theater overwhelmed the prejudices of military policy. The hedgerow country of Normandy was devouring American armored units. Tank battalions were suffering catastrophic losses in the grinding attrition of the Normandy breakout. The army needed armor, needed it desperately, and could no longer afford the luxury of keeping trained, combat-ready units in reserve because of racial ideology. In August 1944, the 761st received deployment orders. They shipped to England in September, a battalion of 696 black soldiers and 30 white officers, crossing an Atlantic prowled by German U-boats, each man carrying the weight of expectation and the burden of representation. They were not just soldiers going to war. They were symbols, ambassadors, and proof of concept for a radical idea, that black men could fight and die for a nation that had not yet granted them full citizenship. They arrived in France on October 10, 1944. While other units might have been granted time to acclimate, to adjust to the sounds and smells of the combat zone, the 761st was immediately attached to General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton, the most aggressive and controversial general in the European theater, needed tanks to maintain the momentum of his eastward drive toward Germany. He needed armor that could punch through prepared defenses, exploit breakthroughs, and maintain pressure on a retreating enemy that was desperately trying to establish new defensive lines. When the 761st reported to 3rd Army headquarters, they encountered Patton himself, a man whose reputation for profanity, aggression, and racial prejudice preceded him. What happened next would become part of the battalion's legend. Patton addressed the assembled battalion on November 2, 1944. Standing before hundreds of black tankers, he delivered a speech that was characteristically blunt. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." It was not a speech about equality or civil rights. It was a speech about killing efficiency and combat effectiveness. But embedded in Patton's crude pragmatism was a revolutionary acknowledgement. He was judging them by their capability to destroy the enemy, not by the color of their skin. It was a low bar for human dignity, but in the context of 1944 America, it represented a significant shift. The 761st would be evaluated on the same merits as every other unit in Patton's command, their ability to advance, to fight, and to win. 5 days later, they attacked. The morning of November 7 brought the 761st into combat against German positions along the Ciel River in eastern France. Their mission was to support the 26th Infantry Division's assault across the river, providing armored support for infantry advances through heavily fortified villages. The Germans had spent weeks preparing their defenses, concrete pillboxes, interlocking fields of fire, carefully registered artillery concentrations, and extensive minefields designed to channel American attacks into kill zones. The Wehrmacht soldiers manning these positions expected a grinding defensive battle. They had fought American armor before, had learned the patterns and tactics of Sherman tank attacks. What they did not expect was the ferocity and precision of the 761 SD's assault. Captain Williams' company crossed the line of departure at 0553 hours, advancing in a staggered formation designed to minimize exposure to anti-tank fire. The Shermans moved through morning mist that clung to the ground like smoke, their commanders scanning for the telltale muzzle flashes that would indicate enemy positions. The first contact came at 0607 hours, a German 75mm anti-tank gun concealed in the rubble of a destroyed barn. The gun crew fired first, their armor-piercing round missing Williams' tank by less than 2 meters, the supersonic crack of the projectile audible even over the roar of the Sherman's engine. Williams' gunner identified the position in seconds, traversed the turret, and fired a high-explosive round that obliterated the gun emplacement. The engagement lasted 11 seconds. It was the first of thousands. The 761st fought through Morville-Lesvic, then Vic-sur-Seille, then Château-Salins, each village a maze of stone buildings that provided perfect defensive positions for German infantry armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The close-quarters fighting was brutal. Sherman tanks were vulnerable in urban terrain, their thin armor susceptible to shape-charge weapons fired from upper-story windows and basement hideouts. The 761st learned to operate in combined arms teams, coordinating with infantry to clear buildings while their tanks provided suppressive fire and direct assault capability. They developed tactics on the move, adapting to German defensive schemes with a speed that impressed even veteran infantry commanders. Within 72 hours of entering combat, the 761st had captured 6 fortified villages, destroyed 17 enemy tanks, eliminated 31 artillery positions, and taken more than 400 prisoners. Their performance was not just adequate, it was exceptional. But exceptional performance came at a cost measured in blood and burning metal. On November 9, 2nd Lieutenant Robert Hammond's tank took a direct hit from a German 88mm gun while supporting an infantry attack outside Bézange-la-Petite. The armor-piercing round penetrated the Sherman's frontal armor, igniting the ammunition stored in the hull. Hammond's crew had 7 seconds to escape before the tank exploded. The driver and bow gunner died in the initial impact. Hammond and his loader survived with severe burns. The loss was devastating, but there was no time to process grief. The attack continued. Hammond's platoon sergeant took command of the platoon, redistributed the surviving crew members to other tanks, and continued the advance. This became the pattern: losses absorbed, missions completed, momentum maintained. Always forward. Never stopping. The Sherman tank, for all its mechanical reliability and ease of production, was outmatched by German armor in terms of firepower and protection. The Panther and Tiger tanks that the 761st encountered mounted high-velocity cannons that could penetrate a Sherman's armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, while the Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to damage German heavy tanks except at close range and from specific angles. This technical disparity meant that American tankers, regardless of race, fought at a significant disadvantage in direct tank-versus-tank engagements. The 761st compensated through superior tactics, aggressive maneuvering, and a willingness to take calculated risks that more cautious units might have avoided. They learned to use terrain to mask their approach, to coordinate multiple tank attacks against single German vehicles, to exploit the slower traverse. Speed of German turrets through rapid position changes. They became hunters who understood they were often outgunned, developing a tactical sophistication born from the necessity of survival. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers emerged as one of the battalion's most effective tank commanders during these early engagements. Rivers, a soft-spoken Oklahoman who had worked as a farm laborer before the war, possessed an uncanny ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy positions. His tank crew trusted him with the absolute faith that combat breeds among men who rely on each other for survival. On November 16, during an attack on the village of Gebling, Rivers' tank hit a German landmine that shattered the road wheel and damaged the track. Standard procedure called for the disabled tank to withdraw for repairs while the attack continued. Rivers assessed the situation differently. With German forces counterattacking and friendly infantry pinned down by machine gun fire, Rivers ordered his driver to continue forward on the damaged track. The Sherman could barely maneuver, its damaged suspension limiting mobility, but its gun still functioned. Rivers positioned his crippled tank to provide suppressive fire while other elements of his company maneuvered against the German positions. For 3 hours, his tank absorbed enemy fire while his gun crew systematically destroyed German strongpoints. The attack succeeded. Rivers' tank finally withdrew when the damaged track broke completely. He climbed from his tank, assessed the damage, and immediately requested assignment to another vehicle. His company commander tried to order him to the rear for medical evaluation. Rivers had sustained shrapnel wounds from near-miss artillery, but Rivers refused. There were not enough experienced tank commanders, he argued. The company needed every combat-effective leader. He was given another tank and returned to the fight. 3 days later, on November 19, near the town of Beining, Rivers' tank column encountered a concealed German anti-tank position during a reconnaissance in force. The first German round destroyed the lead tank instantly. Rivers' tank, second in the column, became the immediate target. He could have reversed, using smoke to cover a withdrawal. Instead, he ordered his driver to advance toward the anti-tank position, closing the range to reduce the German gunner's advantage. His tank took 2 hits in rapid succession. The first penetrated the hull, killing the driver and bow gunner. The second struck the turret, wounding Rivers catastrophically. The loader and gunner escaped through the commander's hatch. Rivers, bleeding from multiple wounds, remained in the turret, attempting to direct fire even as he died. They pulled his body from the tank 20 minutes later, after the German position had been neutralized by supporting artillery. Reuben Rivers would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor, though the award would not be presented until 1997, 53 years after his death, when the Army finally conducted a review of black soldiers denied the nation's highest military honor because of racial discrimination. Rivers' death exemplified the savage arithmetic of the 761 SD's combat experience. They were not rotated out of the line. They were not given extended rest periods. When losses reduced a company's strength, replacement crews were integrated and sent immediately back into combat. The standard practice for American armored battalions was to pull units out of the line after sustained combat operations, allowing for maintenance, rest, and recuperation. The 761st fought continuously from November 7, 1944, through May 6, 1945, 183 consecutive days of combat operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. This sustained deployment resulted in a casualty rate that exceeded 70% by war's end. Every tank in the battalion's original complement was either destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Some crew positions turned over 3 and 4 times as men were killed, wounded, or evacuated for combat fatigue. Yet the battalion's combat effectiveness never wavered. They participated in every major Third Army offensive during that period, the reduction of the Maginot Line fortifications, the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, the breaking of the Siegfried Line, the crossing of the Rhine River, and the final drive into southern Germany and Austria. Each operation added to their combat record, villages captured, enemy units destroyed, impossible missions accomplished. The men of the 761st became ghosts in their own bodies, operating on instinct and training when conscious thought became too exhausting. Sleep came in 15-minute intervals between attacks. Meals were eaten cold from cans while the tank was moving. Maintenance was performed under blackout conditions with German artillery randomly pounding approach roads. The only constant was forward movement and the next objective. The symbolism of their service extended far beyond tactical accomplishments. Every German soldier who surrendered to a black American tanker, every Wehrmacht unit destroyed by the 761st, represented a direct refutation of Nazi racial ideology. Hitler's regime had built its entire worldview on the concept of Aryan supremacy and the racial inferiority of non-white peoples. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich had portrayed black Americans as subhuman, as evidence of American racial degeneracy. When German soldiers found themselves outfought and outmaneuvered by black tankers, the cognitive dissonance was profound. Prisoners taken by the 761st often expressed genuine shock that their captors were black Americans. Some had assumed, based on Nazi propaganda, that black soldiers would be poorly trained and equipped, relegated to menial roles. Instead, they encountered highly competent armored forces employing sophisticated combined arms tactics. This psychological impact extended to American forces as well. White infantry units that fought alongside the 761st developed a respect forged in shared combat. When your attack is being supported by tank fire that allows you to advance, when your position is being reinforced by armored vehicles that draw enemy fire away from your foxhole, the race of the tank commander becomes irrelevant. What matters is competence, reliability, and courage under fire. The 761st earned a reputation within Third Army as a unit that could be depended upon to accomplish difficult missions. They were frequently assigned to spearhead attacks, to serve as exploitation forces, to take on objectives that other units had failed to capture. This was not always fair. Sometimes it represented commanders using the Black Battalion for high-risk missions to spare white units, but it also reflected a growing recognition that the 761st was simply very good at armored warfare. December 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West. On December 16, German forces launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, creating a bulge in the American lines and threatening to split Allied armies. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in the Belgian town of Bastogne, became the focal point of American defensive efforts. Patton's Third Army pivoted 90 degrees north and launched a relief attack toward Bastogne through some of the worst winter weather Europe had experienced in decades. The 761st Tank Battalion was at the spearhead of that attack. The weather itself became an enemy. Temperatures plummeted below zero. Snow fell in heavy, wind-driven waves that reduced visibility to meters. The muddy roads of autumn froze into rutted, uneven surfaces that broke tank tracks and shattered road wheels. Tanks designed for the moderate climates of France struggled in Arctic conditions. Engines refused to start without hours of preheating. Gun mechanisms froze. Ammunition had to be warmed before firing to prevent breech malfunctions. The men suffered from frostbite, trench foot, and exposure. They wrapped blankets around their bodies under their uniforms, stuffed newspapers into their boots for insulation, and kept moving because to stop was to freeze. The 761st attacked north on December 31, fighting through German positions that had been reinforced during the American defensive phase. The Battle of Tillet, a small Belgian village that became a crucial junction point, exemplified the brutal close-quarters fighting of this period. German paratroopers and SS units defended the village with fanatical determination. The 761 SD's tanks advanced through deep snow, supporting infantry from the 87th Infantry Division in house-to-house fighting. Visibility was so poor that engagements occurred at ranges of less than 50 meters. Tank commanders fought with their heads exposed above the turret because closed hatches meant fighting blind. The cold metal of the hatch rim burned exposed skin. Exhaled breath froze on faces and gun sights. The battle for Tilsit lasted 3 days. When it ended, the village had been reduced to rubble, but the German defensive line had been broken. The road to Bastogne lay open. Throughout this period, the 761st maintained a remarkable esprit de corps despite conditions that would have broken lesser units. They developed their own identity, their own culture within the larger army. Their unofficial motto became, "Come out fighting," a phrase that captured both their aggressive tactical approach and their determination to prove themselves in a segregated military. They painted the motto on their tanks alongside unit insignia, a black panther, chosen long before the later political connotations of that symbol, representing strength, stealth, and ferocity. The Black Panther on a Sherman tank became their signature, a visual declaration of identity that German intelligence reports began to specifically mention. The food became a recurring element in their experience, a strange point of contrast that highlighted the absurd abundance of American military logistics even in the midst of combat. German soldiers, by late 1944, were subsisting on reduced rations, their supply lines strained by Allied bombing and the general collapse of German logistics. Wehrmacht troops in defensive positions often survived on black bread, ersatz coffee, and whatever they could scavenge from the countryside. When the 761st overran German positions, they found enemy soldiers who were genuinely malnourished, whose uniforms hung loose on gaunt frames. Meanwhile, American supply lines delivered a staggering variety of food to frontline units. The men of the 761st ate canned meat, condensed milk, chocolate bars, cigarettes, coffee, all delivered with mechanical regularity despite combat conditions. They heated their rations on the engine decks of their tanks, metal cans placed against superheated steel, cooking spam and hash while the tank idled between attacks. German prisoners, offered American rations, often ate with a desperation that spoke to months of deprivation. The food became a symbol of the industrial and economic disparity between the combatants. The Americans could afford to feed their frontline troops beef and sugar while simultaneously producing thousands of tanks, millions of artillery shells, and an endless stream of replacement equipment. The Germans could not. And that material difference, multiplied across every category of supply and production, was crushing the Third Reich as surely as any tactical maneuver. By March 1945, the 761st had crossed into Germany proper, fighting through the industrial regions of the Saar and the Palatinate. The character of the fighting changed as the Wehrmacht's organized defenses began to collapse. Resistance became sporadic but no less deadly, isolated strongpoints defended by SS units, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth fanatics who fought with the desperation of true believers. The 761st encountered children in uniform, teenagers armed with Panzerfausts, fighting and dying for a regime that was already dead. These engagements were psychologically devastating for the American tankers, who found themselves killing boys who should have been in school. But the children were armed, the weapons were real, and the war continued. On March 20, 1945, the 761st reached the Rhine River at Oppenheim. They participated in the Third Army's crossing of Germany's greatest natural barrier, their Shermans loading onto pontoon bridges while German artillery pounded the crossing sites. The Rhine crossing represented the symbolic end of German defensive capability. Beyond the river lay the industrial heartland of Germany, the road to Berlin, and the final collapse of the Nazi state. The 761st pushed east through Bavaria, encountering diminishing but still lethal resistance. They liberated forced labor camps, discovered the evidence of Nazi atrocities, and witnessed firsthand the human cost of the ideology they had been fighting against. The encounter with concentration camp survivors created a complex emotional resonance for the black soldiers of the 761st. Here were victims of racial ideology, people who had been systematically dehumanized, enslaved, and murdered because the Nazi regime deemed them subhuman. The parallels to American racial oppression were impossible to ignore, even as the scale and industrialized nature of the Holocaust represented something categorically different. The men of the 761st fed the survivors from their own rations, shared medical supplies, and provided what comfort combat soldiers could offer to people who had experienced horrors beyond comprehension. They did this while knowing that they would return to an America where they could not vote in many states, where they would be refused service at restaurants, where their uniforms would not protect them from discrimination and violence. The irony was not lost on them. They were liberating victims of fascism while serving a nation that had not yet liberated itself from its own racial caste system. The war ended for the 761st Tank Battalion on May 6, 1945, in the Austrian town of Steyr. They had advanced farther east than any other Third Army unit, reaching the demarcation line with Soviet forces. When the ceasefire order came, many of the men simply stopped, unable to fully process that they had survived. The battalion had lost 71 men killed in action, 233 wounded, and dozens more evacuated for combat fatigue and non-battle injuries. They had earned 1 Medal of Honor, posthumously, after decades of denial, 11 Silver Stars, 69 Bronze Stars, and 296 Purple Hearts. They had destroyed or captured more than 6,000 enemy soldiers, destroyed 461 German vehicles, and captured 331 towns and villages across 6 countries. The numbers were impressive, but they were also inadequate to capture what had actually been accomplished. The 761st had proven, conclusively and in the most demanding crucible available, that black soldiers could not only fight effectively but could excel in complex, high-intensity combat operations. They had demonstrated that segregation and discrimination were policy choices, not reflections of natural ability. Every German tank they destroyed, every objective they captured, every mission they accomplished was evidence in a larger argument about human capability and the lies that sustain systems of oppression. The men of the 761st had fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against Nazi Germany, the other against the low expectations and racial prejudice of their own nation. They won both. The symbolism of their service extended into the post-war period, though recognition came slowly and incompletely. The battalion was inactivated in June 1946, its men dispersed back to a segregated America that was not yet ready to acknowledge fully what they had accomplished. Many returned to communities where their military service was viewed with suspicion or resentment, where their combat decorations meant little in a society that still enforced racial hierarchies through law and custom. The GI Bill provided educational and housing benefits that theoretically applied to all veterans, but discriminatory implementation meant that black veterans often could not access those benefits on equal terms. The men of the 761st had fought for democracy abroad, and many would spend the next decades fighting for it at home, becoming participants in the civil rights movement that would finally begin to dismantle legal segregation. But the legacy of the 761st existed beyond individual trajectories. Their combat record became evidence cited in the military integration debates of the late 1940s. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, mandating the integration of the armed forces, the performance of units like the 761st provided empirical support for the policy change. The Army could no longer credibly argue that black soldiers were unsuitable for combat roles when the 761st had earned a Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism during the Battle of the Bulge. The tank commanders who had fought for 183 consecutive days became proof that segregation was militarily inefficient as well as morally indefensible. The Sherman tanks they drove, those mechanically reliable but undergunned machines, became artifacts of a transformation. Each vehicle carried the scars of combat, armor dented by near-miss anti-tank rounds, paint scorched by fires, interiors stained with the blood of wounded crews. But they also carried something less tangible, the accumulated weight of meaning that comes when objects become symbols. A Sherman tank with a Black Panther painted on its hull represented more than 33 tons of steel and machinery. It represented the refutation of lies, the validation of human dignity, and the promise that courage and competence could not be permanently suppressed by systems of oppression. 183 days without rest. Without rotation. Without relief. The number itself became part of the legend, a measure of endurance that exceeded normal human limits and standard military practice. But the true measure was not in days or casualty statistics or the number of enemy units destroyed. The true measure was in the transformation they forced upon the institution that had tried to limit them, an American military that entered World War II as a segregated force and emerged from it with the empirical evidence necessary to begin the long process of integration. The 761st did not win that larger battle alone, they were part of a broader struggle involving hundreds of thousands of black service members across all branches. But they provided something crucial, undeniable proof, written in German defeat and American victory, that racial ideology was a choice, not a destiny. The epilogue to their story continues in the present, in every integrated military unit, in every diverse tank crew, in every assumption of equality that would have seemed impossible in 1944. The men of the 761st fought with the knowledge that they were being judged not just as soldiers but as representatives of an entire race, that their failures would be used to justify continued discrimination while their successes would be minimized or ignored. They carried that burden alongside their combat equipment, and they refused to break under the weight. They came out fighting, maintained the attack for 6 months of continuous combat, and returned home to an America that was not yet worthy of their sacrifice. But their service helped create the conditions for a more worthy nation, one that would take decades more to approach but whose possibility became more real because they had proven what was possible. The sound that follows them through history is not the roar of Sherman engines or the crack of 75mm guns, though those sounds define their combat experience. The sound that endures is quieter, more persistent, the steady rhythm of tank treads on frozen ground, moving forward through the snow and mud and blood of 183 days, never stopping, never retreating, always advancing toward a future that they fought to create but might never fully see. That sound, of progress measured in meters and paid for in lives, remains the truest monument to their service. It echoes still, in every person who serves without limitation, who demands recognition not as a favor but as a right, who understands that freedom is not granted but seized and defended by those who refuse to accept anything less. The 761st Tank Battalion broke Hitler's lines for 183 days straight. But the line they truly shattered was the one that said they could not, should not, would not. And in breaking that lie, they changed not just the war, but the nation, and the future that followed.